The silence emanating from the sovereign's central administrative offices on the morning of the 30th of June 2026 was not one of structural peace, but of absolute calculated finality. Behind the heavy timber doors of the Privy Purse, a document bearing the dual, unspoken consensus of Princess Anne and William, Prince of Wales, was formally logged into the sovereign's executive registry. It did not legally banish Queen Camilla from the geographical boundaries of the royal estate, nor did it spark a constitutional crisis that would require the direct intervention of the Prime Minister. Instead, it did something far more lethal to the survival of her non-dynastic household. It instituted a total financial embargo. The directive, known colloquially among senior courtiers as the Buckingham Operational Restructuring Mandate, has effectively frozen the capital reserves earmarked for the long-term structural maintenance, private security adjustments, and architectural upgrades of the properties tethered to the Parker-Bowles lineage. In a single, sweeping administrative stroke, the future sovereign and the king's most trusted sister have erected an impenetrable financial cordon sanitaire around the monarchy, trapping the queen consort within a golden cage while systematically starving her private family's secondary escape routes. The crisis, which had been simmering since the late-night signing of King Charles III's personal declaration, degrading Camilla's future ceremonial standing to that of a mere sovereign's wife, escalated into an outright war of attrition when royal auditors discovered a series of unauthorized financial drafts. For months, under the radar of the keeper of the Privy Purse, discretionary funds totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds had been subtly allocated toward the infrastructural overhaul of private estates outside the Crown Estate's portfolio, specifically properties linked to Camilla's children, Tom Parker-Bowles and Laura Lopes. The justification from the Queen's Auxiliary Office had been framed as necessary security preparation for extended maternal residencies. However, to Princess Anne, the long-standing warden of the royal family's internal accounts, and Prince Wales, the ultimate custodian of the Duchy of Cornwall's multi-billion-pound apparatus, this was viewed as an unacceptable diversion of sovereign capital to line the pockets of a non-bloodline dynasty. The response was swift, surgical, and terrifyingly precise. The ultimatum delivered to the Queen's private quarters did not come from the king. It came from the combined authority of the two individuals who control the physical and financial machinery of the House of Windsor. The text of the document was devoid of emotional prose, focusing entirely on the cold mechanics of asset management. All discretionary allowances derived from the Privy Purse for the maintenance of Ray Mill House, Camilla's private country residence in Wiltshire, which has long served as the operational base for her children and grandchildren, were suspended indefinitely. Furthermore, the Crown Estate Commissioners were instructed to halt all pending architectural surveys and structural renovations funded by the state for any suite or ancillary building currently occupied by staff dedicated exclusively to the Queen's independent philanthropic network. The message was clear. The institutional survival of the Parker-Bowles family within the parameters of the British state has been brought to a grinding, permanent halt. To understand the brutal efficiency of this financial decapitation, one must examine the extraordinary convergence of interests between Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, and William, Prince of Wales. Historically, the two have operated in distinct spheres of royal governance. Anne is the institutional workhorse, a traditionalist who views the monarchy through the lens of absolute frugality, unyielding duty, and the rigid preservation of the late Queen Elizabeth II's operational standards. William, conversely, is the modernist CEO, a future king hyper-focused on public relations, long-term brand viability, and streamlining the monarchy to survive in an era of intense democratic scrutiny. Yet, the perceived overreach of the Queen Consort's private office achieved what many within the palace thought impossible. It created a flawless, unyielding alliance between the old guard and the new regime. For Princess Anne, the motivation was deeply rooted in the preservation of the family's historic integrity. Throughout the decades of Charles and Camilla's long, turbulent journey toward the throne, Anne remained a watchful, often skeptical observer of the subtle shifting of palace dynamics. When Charles ascended, the subsequent expansion of Camilla's personal staff and the creeping inclusion of her family members into high-profile royal enclaves, such as the coronation guest list and private holiday gatherings at Sandringham, stirred deep-seated concerns within the Princess Royal. Anne recognized that every pound spent on elevating the profile or securing the future comfort of the Parker-Bowles estate was a pound subtracted from the legitimate bloodline descendants of the House of Windsor. When the internal audit exposed the overlapping funding requests for the refurbishment of secondary residences, Anne did not hesitate. She utilized her immense leverage over the royal household's domestic operations to shut down the pipeline, transforming her reputation for frugality into a weapon of structural containment. Prince William's calculations, while aligned with his aunt's sense of fiscal propriety, were driven by the long-term strategic defense of his own impending reign. The Prince of Wales has watched with growing alarm as the Sussex collapse and the public's changing attitudes toward royal privilege have narrowed the margin for institutional error. William understood that the presence of a secondary, competing family network operating under the implicit protection of the Queen Consort was a catastrophic public relations liability. If the British public discovered that sovereign funds or resources tied to the royal estate were being utilized to subsidize the private lifestyles or commercial ventures of non-working, non-bloodline individuals, the damage to the monarchy's standing would be irreparable. By entering into this ice alliance with Princess Anne, William has effectively neutralized the threat before it could manifest as a public scandal. He has taken control of the narrative, ensuring that when he ultimately ascends the throne, the financial accounts of the monarchy will be entirely scrubbed of any lingering entanglements with the Queen's private family. The actual execution of the ultimatum has been carried out with a level of bureaucratic ruthlessness that has stunned the Queen's remaining loyalists. The embargo operates on three distinct financial fronts, each designed to systematically dismantle the logistical support structure that Camilla had spent the last 4 years building. The first and most immediate blow was the total liquidation of the Queen's Discretionary Architectural Fund, a specialized sub-account managed within the Royal Palace's sovereign grant allocation. This fund, which historically allowed the consort to authorize minor structural repairs and interior upgrades to residential quarters without seeking full parliamentary or prime ministerial approval, has been completely absorbed back into the central treasury. Consequently, the ongoing multi-million-pound modernization of the private apartments within Clarence House, intended to serve as Camilla's primary sanctuary, should she outlive the king, has been abruptly halted, leaving the project frozen in mid-renovation. The second front targeting the Queen's survival strategy is the absolute quarantine of the accounts linked to Ray Mill House. For years, the property had benefited from an intricate network of security subsidies and land management grants that, while technically private, were facilitated through royal administrative channels due to the owner's status as Queen Consort. By order of the Prince of Wales, acting in coordination with the Duchy of Cornwall's Executive Board, all cross-institutional agreements providing administrative or logistical support to the Wiltshire estate have been severed. The private security details assigned to the property have been told that any future upgrades to the estate's perimeter fencing, electronic surveillance networks, or auxiliary staff housing must be paid for entirely out of the private capital of the Parker Bowles family. The financial safety net that ensured the property could function as an alternative, state-protected court has been completely removed. Finally, the embargo has targeted the indirect commercial and philanthropic avenues used by Camilla's children to maintain their proximity to the royal brand. Under the strict terms of the ultimatum, no organization, charity, or commercial entity possessing a royal warrant or operating under the patronage of the King or the Prince of Wales is permitted to enter into contractual agreements, consulting roles, or promotional partnerships with individuals belonging to the Parker Bowles family. This has effectively severed Tom Parker Bowles' lucrative, unspoken connections to high-end culinary partnerships that relied on the implicit prestige of his mother's title, and has isolated Laura Lope's art curation ventures from royal-adjacent gallery funding. The message delivered by Anne and William's administrative executioners is absolute. The entry points to the royal treasury have been bricked shut, and the escape routes for those who sought to benefit from the Queen's elevation have been completely demolished. The implementation of the financial embargo against the household of the Queen Consort was not merely a sudden reaction to a single administrative dispute, but rather the culmination of a meticulously planned forensic investigation spearheaded by Princess Anne. For several months preceding the public confrontation at St. George's Hall, the Princess Royal had quietly instructed a specialized team of internal auditors from the Privy Purse to conduct a comprehensive review of all discretionary spending associated with the Queen's auxiliary offices. What these investigators uncovered was a highly sophisticated network of reallocated funds, subtle structural subsidies, and overlapping expense accounts that had been quietly designed to guarantee the long-term financial independence and social prominence of the Parker Bowles family. The discoveries within these ledgers provided the precise ammunition that Princess Anne and the Prince of Wales required to convince the king that immediate institutional intervention was an absolute necessity for the survival of the monarchy. The central focus of the intensive audit was the unauthorized diversion of capital from the royal palace's sovereign grant toward the private maintenance of non-bloodline assets. Historically, the sovereign grant is strictly regulated by parliamentary oversight and is explicitly intended to support the official duties of the working royal family and the preservation of the historic estate. Yet, the internal investigation revealed that the Queen's private secretary had utilized highly ambiguous accounting loopholes to classify extensive structural upgrades at Mill House as essential security countermeasures. Necessitated by the Queen's public elevation, this classification allowed the private country estate in Wiltshire to absorb significant amounts of state-funded technological infrastructure, landscape stabilization, and auxiliary housing renovations without triggering the standard alarms within the central treasury. To Princess Anne, this maneuver was not a matter of routine security preparation, but an egregious breach of fiscal trust that threatened to expose the entire royal institution to severe public condemnation. Upon receiving the finalized audit report, Prince William immediately recognized that the situation extended far beyond a simple disagreement over domestic accounting. For the Prince of Wales, the presence of these hidden financial pipelines represented a profound structural vulnerability that could deeply compromise the opening years of his own future reign. The prince had watched with deep concern as the public tolerance for aristocratic privilege shifted globally, and he was acutely aware that the contemporary electorate demanded absolute transparency regarding sovereign wealth. If investigative journalists or anti-monarchical advocacy groups were to uncover evidence that public funds or royal inheritance reserves were being subtly funneled to subsidize the lifestyles, estates, and private business ventures of individuals who held no official constitutional role, the resulting backlash would severely destabilize the House of Windsor. Therefore, William determined that the response must be absolute, permanent, and entirely unyielding, leaving no room for negotiation or compromise. The resulting joint directive from Princess Anne and Prince William targeted the very heart of the Queen's operational capability by executing what courtiers have described as a total lockdown of the privy purse. The first decisive measure enacted under this mandate was the immediate termination of the administrative flexibility previously enjoyed by the Queen's personal staff. All purchasing power, discretionary grant allocations, and independent contracting privileges were stripped from her auxiliary offices and consolidated under the direct, rigid supervision of the Keeper of the Privy Purse, a veteran official fiercely loyal to the traditional bloodline. From that moment onward, every single invoice, travel, request, and maintenance expenditure generated by the Queen's Circle had to be submitted to a hostile review board, where even the smallest deviation from standard protocol resulted in an immediate freeze of funds. This bureaucratic strangulation effectively paralyzed the Queen's ability to maintain her personal networks of influence and charity management. Simultaneously, the alliance turned its attention toward the secondary financial escape routes that had been prepared for the Parker Bowles children, Tom and Laura. For years, the implicit prestige of the Queen's title had functioned as an unwritten but highly lucrative commercial asset, allowing her family members to secure high-profile advisory positions, elite artistic patronages, and exclusive corporate partnerships with businesses that sought royal favor. To dismantle this soft influence, Prince William issued a strict internal declaration across the entire Duchy of Cornwall and the broader Crown estate apparatus. This directive explicitly prohibited any commercial tenant, luxury supplier holding a royal warrant, or institution receiving royal patronage from engaging in any financial agreements, promotional campaigns, or consulting contracts with the non-bloodline descendants of the Queen. Within 48 hours, the commercial leverage that the Parker Bowles family had spent years cultivating was completely neutralized, isolating them from the lucrative economic orbit of the British state. The emotional fallout within the private quarters of Clarence House was catastrophic. When the Queen was presented with the detailed terms of the lockdown, she realized that her position had been rendered completely unsustainable. She could no longer use her elevated status to shield her children from financial scrutiny, nor could she guarantee that her private sanctuary in Wiltshire would remain viable without the massive state subsidies she had previously secured. In a desperate attempt to halt the bureaucratic onslaught, the Queen sought a private audience with King Charles III, appealing to the decades of shared sacrifice public hostility, and personal devotion that had defined their relationship. She argued passionately that this financial decapitation was not an act of statecraft, but a targeted, malicious humiliation designed to strip her of her dignity and leave her family entirely vulnerable to their enemies. However, the king's response revealed the profound limits of his personal power when confronted by the united front of his sister and his heir. Although deeply distressed by the evident suffering of his wife, Charles understood that he could not overrule the combined authority of Princess Anne and the Prince of Wales without tearing the royal family apart from within. The king was acutely aware that his own health and the stability of his reign depended on the absolute loyalty of William and the flawless management of the royal estates by Anne. Confronted with the undeniable evidence of the unauthorized financial drafts and facing the very real threat of an internal rebellion by the senior leadership of the household, the king chose to remain silent. He withdrew his personal protection from the Queen's administrative apparatus, signaling to the auditors that the relentless execution of the embargo would proceed without imperial interference. As the second phase of this silent purge drew to a close, the true structural isolation of the Queen Consort became undeniably clear to all observers within the palace walls. There were no public denunciations, no overt displays of hostility on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and no sensational press releases issued to the national broadcasters. Instead, the victory of the alliance was written in the silent cancellation of refurbishment contracts, the sudden withdrawal of private security upgrades from Wiltshire, and the total administrative quarantine of the Queen's remaining staff. Princess Anne and Thun Vung William had successfully demonstrated that while a king may bestow a title out of affection, the cold, unyielding machinery of the British monarchy is controlled by those who guard the bloodline and hold the keys to the treasury. The financial cordon was complete, and the future of the Parker-Bowles family within the sovereign realm had been permanently extinguished. The operational containment executed by Princess Anne and the Prince of Wales moved swiftly from the suppression of internal accounts to the systematic isolation of the Queen's immediate family from the social and economic structures of the state. Tom Parker-Bowles and Laura Lopes, who had gradually transitioned from private citizens into high-profile fixtures at sovereign events, suddenly found themselves facing an invisible but absolute administrative barrier. The strategy employed by the Royal Alliance was not to launch a public campaign of exclusion, which might generate public sympathy for the Queen's children, but rather to implement a quiet, institutional quarantine. By removing their names from the official guest lists of all future state receptions, diplomatic gatherings, and intimate family assemblies at Sandringham and Windsor, the alliance signaled to the British establishment that the Parker-Bowles connection was no longer a viable pathway to royal favor or influence. This institutional quarantine had an immediate and devastating impact on the various commercial and charitable ventures that the Queen's children had established over the preceding years. In the contemporary landscape of British high society, the unspoken endorsement of the monarchy is a priceless commodity that can transform a private business or philanthropic foundation into an immensely lucrative enterprise. Tom Parker-Bowles had long benefited from this dynamic, securing premium publishing contracts, international culinary consulting roles, and partnerships with luxury food purveyors who subtly capitalized on his direct access to the court. However, when the Prince of Wales enforced the strict non-intercourse directive across the Duchy of Cornwall and all entities holding royal warrants, those commercial partners quickly realized that maintaining their association with the Queen's son carried an unacceptable risk of losing their coveted royal status. Within a matter of weeks, major corporate sponsors began quietly letting their contracts with the Queen's family expire, citing routine corporate restructuring rather than palace pressure. The liquidation of influence extended with equal severity to the philanthropic sector, where Laura Lopes had built a respectable network of art patronages and gallery connections. Under the traditional rules of royal engagement, charities and cultural institutions often compete fiercely to secure the involvement of individuals associated with the sovereign, using these connections to attract wealthy international donors and secure state-backed grants. The joint directive issued by the Princess Royal effectively brought this practice to an end for the Queen's family. Senior courtiers were instructed to inform the directors of major national galleries and cultural heritage funds that any future projects featuring the active involvement or promotion of the Parker-Bowles family would no longer be considered for joint patronages with working members of the House of Patron, Windsor. This subtle but devastating warning forced institutional boards to immediately distance themselves from the Queen's daughter, effectively freezing her ability to operate within the elite circles of the British art world. As these economic and social lifelines were systematically severed, the structural vulnerability of the Queen's position within the palace became absolute. She was forced to witness her children being stripped of the residual prestige she had fought for decades to provide for them, while she herself remained confined within the rigid boundaries of her newly diminished role as the mere wife of the king. The grand strategy of Princess Anne and Prince William had achieved its primary objective without causing a single ripple of public scandal. They had successfully proven that the power of the Queen Consort was not an inherent right but a temporary privilege, and by locking the vaults of the state, they had ensured that the non-bloodline lineage of Camilla would leave no permanent mark on the history or the treasury of the British monarchy. The administrative strangulation of the Queen's auxiliary household inevitably triggered a profound domestic crisis within the private residences of the sovereign. As the full weight of the financial embargo became undeniable, the atmosphere inside Clarence House, the long-standing London sanctuary of King Charles III and his wife, descended into an oppressive silence. The Queen realized that the bureaucratic walls were closing in not only on her personal staff but on the very survival of her family legacy. The systematic cancellation of the maintenance grants for her private property and the social quarantine of her children had left her completely isolated within the machinery of the state. Driven by a mixture of deep resentment and maternal desperation, she requested a private meeting with the king, determined to force her husband to choose between his institutional compliance and his personal devotion to their marriage. The confrontation that took place behind the closed doors of the king's private study was devoid of the standard diplomatic courtesies that usually govern the interactions of the royal household. The Queen presented the king with the documented evidence of the Privy Purse lockdown, pointing directly to the signed directives from Princess Anne and the Prince of Wales that had effectively frozen her operational independence. She argued with intense emotion that the actions of his sister and his eldest son were not merely routine adjustments to the royal budget, but a calculated, public humiliation intended to strip her of all remaining dignity before the eyes of the court and the nation. She reminded the king of the decades of intense public hostility, media intrusion, and familial rejection they had endured together, demanding to know why he was now allowing his own family to dismantle the security and status he had spent his entire life promising to provide for her. Yet, the king's reaction to his wife's appeals revealed the profound and tragic limits of his contemporary authority when balanced against the survival of the institution itself. King Charles III found himself caught in an impossible vice between his deep, enduring affection for his wife and the unyielding realities of constitutional continuity. The Prince of Wales and the Princess Royal had presented the king with an absolute front, backing their financial demands with the undeniable evidence of unauthorized expenditure drafts and the very real threat of a broader institutional rebellion among the senior courtiers. The king understood that his current reign, already facing immense scrutiny, could not withstand an internal civil war with his heir, who controlled the immense wealth of the Duchy of Cornwall, and his sister, who held the absolute loyalty of the domestic operations of the monarchy. Confronted with the stark reality that defying William and Anne would permanently fracture the House of Windsor and destabilize the crown, the king chose the path of institutional preservation. He remained silent, refusing to issue the counter-orders that would have dissolved the financial cordon around his wife's family. By lowering his eyes and declining to intervene, the king gave his tacit approval to the ruthless measures enacted by the alliance. This agonizing silence was the ultimate betrayal for the queen, confirming that when the survival of the Vungmyrn was at stake, even the longest personal romance in royal history could be sacrificed to the cold, unyielding demands of the bloodline. The compliance of King Charles III to the administrative embargo initiated an immediate and total transfer of operational authority within the palace ecosystem, marking the beginning of a profound transformation in how royal assets were managed and distributed. With the Queen's independent office effectively neutralized and her discretionary budgets completely absorbed back into the central treasury, Princess Anne and the Prince of Wales moved to solidify their control over the physical and financial structures that had previously supported her circle. This phase of the operation was characterized by an unyielding attention to detail, as the royal alliance sought to ensure that no loophole remained for the Queen's family to regain their footing within the institution. Every asset, from physical properties to official patronages, was systematically evaluated, reallocated, or permanently retired under the strict supervision of the newly empowered Central Review Board. The most tangible manifestation of this restructuring was the total reorganization of the domestic staff and the physical spaces within the royal residences. The auxiliary quarters at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle that had been occupied by the Queen's dedicated administrative team were officially decommissioned over a single weekend. Senior courtiers overseen by Princess Anne directed that all specialized communication equipment, files, and personal effects belonging to the Queen's former advisors be transferred to a centralized archival facility or returned to private possession. The staff members themselves were faced with a stark ultimatum. They could either accept immediate reassignments to the central royal household, where their duties would be strictly monitored by traditionalist officials, or they could opt for a voluntary severance package that required the signing of absolute, lifelong non-disclosure agreements. By dismantling the human infrastructure that had surrounded the Queen, the alliance ensured that she was completely cut off from the internal intelligence of the court. Simultaneously, the Prince of Wales directed a massive reallocation of the Queen's former public responsibilities and ceremonial patronages, transferring them directly to the younger generation of working royals. This move was carefully calculated to project an image of seamless institutional continuity to the British public, while completely erasing the Queen's unique influence from the national landscape. Highly sought-after charitable patronages in the arts, literature, and domestic welfare, which the Queen had spent years cultivating as the foundation of her public identity, were quietly reassigned to Catherine, Princess of Wales, and other bloodline members of the family. When these organizations received official notifications from the palace, they were instructed to update their promotional materials and public directories immediately, removing all references to the Queen Consort and replacing them with the names of their new royal protectors. The speed and efficiency with which this transition was executed left the affected charities with no choice but to comply, further isolating the Queen from her established network of public support. As the physical and administrative assets were stripped away, the financial containment reached its absolute peak with the permanent restructuring of the inheritance and residency agreements managed by the Crown Estate. For decades, it had been an unwritten assumption within the court that in the event of the King's demise, the Queen would retain the unrestricted use of several high-profile royal properties, including Clarence House and specific private cottages on the Sandringham estate, to maintain her social standing and comfort. However, the new administrative guidelines drawn up by the Prince of Wales completely rewrote these contingencies. The updated protocols established that any future residency granted to the King's wife would be subject to the strict approval of the reigning monarch and would be conditional upon her total withdrawal from all public life and the complete exclusion of the Parker Bowles family from the premise. The luxurious safety net that had been designed to protect her future independence was replaced with a set of rigid, conditional restrictions that guaranteed her permanent subordination to the future king. The realization that her future security had been completely compromised left the Queen in a state of profound psychological isolation. She found herself living within a palace where her title remained technically valid, yet her actual authority was less than that of a junior courtier. Every interaction with the household staff reminded her of her diminished status, as every request she made for transportation, security, or domestic adjustments had to be thoroughly vetted and approved by a centralized bureaucracy that answered directly to Princess Anne. Her daily routine was reduced to a series of quiet, unpublicized activities within the private apartments of Clarence House, entirely detached from the grand state occasions and diplomatic receptions that continued to define the public face of the monarchy. The alliance had successfully demonstrated that they did not need to physically exile the Queen from the kingdom to neutralize her presence. They had achieved the same result by simply removing the economic and structural foundations that allowed her to exist as an independent force within the House of Windsor. The final phase of the administrative quarantine reached its absolute completion as the public face of the British monarchy adjusted to the cold, unyielding reality established by Princess Anne and the Prince of Wales. The financial cordon sanitaire that had been erected around the Queen Consort and her private lineage was no longer a temporary measure or a subject of intense negotiation behind palace doors. It had become a permanent fixture of the contemporary state. The British public, while sensing a subtle shift in the presentation of the royal family, remained entirely unaware of the absolute bureaucratic execution that had taken place within the central treasury. There were no dramatic public pronouncements or constitutional crises to disrupt the stability of the realm. Instead, the total victory of the bloodline was written in the quiet, permanent erasure of the Parker Bowles name from the long-term history of the House of Windsor. For the Queen, The arrival of this final state of isolation brought a profound, inescapable clarity to her remaining years within the court. She continued to appear alongside King Charles III at specific, highly controlled events where her physical presence was deemed necessary to maintain the public illusion of marital and institutional unity. Yet, those who observed her closely within the palace walls noted that the fierce, resilient spirit that had carried her through decades of public hostility had been entirely replaced by a quiet, mechanical compliance. She walked through the grand galleries of Buckingham Palace, not as a co-ruler or a source of independent influence, but as a silent companion, entirely dependent on the strict, conditional allowances granted by her husband's sister and his heir. The grand ambition of establishing a secondary, protected dynasty for her own children had been completely dismantled, leaving her to face the sunset of her life within a golden cage of absolute containment. Meanwhile, the true architects of this silent purge looked toward the future with a profound sense of security. Prince William had successfully demonstrated his willingness to utilize the absolute weight of financial and administrative power to protect the long-term viability of his future reign, cleansing the institution of any non-bloodline entanglements before his own ascension. Princess Anne had once again fulfilled her sacred duty as the ultimate guardian of the family accounts and the rigid standards of Queen Elizabeth II, ensuring that every asset within the sovereign grant remained dedicated exclusively to those who possessed the legitimate blood right to the throne. The House of Windsor had faced the internal challenge to its centralized authority and had responded with a terrifying, quiet precision. The keys to the treasury remained firmly in the hands of the rightful heirs, and the boundaries of the crown had been redrawn with a cold finality that no future outsider would ever dare to challenge.